Welcome to another episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host here on Wararka Media. On this week's program, the Somali federal government has curtailed an illegal deal reached between the Somaliland administration and UAE, which would have seen 10,000 Afghans destined for the US to be screened and processed in the Somaliland regions. Also on the program, how has the Middle Eastern Cold War affected Somalia, its relations with neighboring Middle Eastern states, and its own continued internal disputes? These are just some of the topics on the program this evening. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to Wararka Media. Let's get straight into it. Sources within the Somali government contacted by Wararka Media have confirmed behind the scenes that the government had aborted an attempted discreet plot by the UAE and the Somaliland administration to relocate over 10,000 Afghans initially designated to Abu Dhabi to be settled in the Somaliland regions before departure to the United States. This comes following consultations between the US State Department and the Somali embassy in the United States following exposure of the plan by the Somali federal government. As a result, the US government has assured the Somali federal government that it will not agree to any action or policy within Somalia without the consultation of the central government in Mogadishu. Indeed, the US doesn't have any official representation in Hargeisa, with the only US representatives based in Mogadishu. Now, Wararka Media has made extensive efforts to reach out to the Hargeisa-appointed Somaliland representative to the United States, Bashir God, to no avail. According to sources close to Wararka Media, Mr. God was reported to be involved in negotiations to transfer 10,000 Afghans along with an unnamed US organization, which was also heavily involved in the negotiations and mediations between the US government, the UAE, and the Somaliland authorities. Sources have told behind the scenes that the UAE had allegedly promised Somaliland more support for international recognition in exchange for taking Afghans destined for the UAE. Now, the Somali government has described such a scenario as a major national security threat. The reality is that the Somali government doesn't have any means to support or vet refugees, let alone care for them. With Somalia being heavily infiltrated by terrorist groups such as Al-Shabaab and ISIS, the possibility of militants and sympathizers slipping through the cracks is high, which would be an extreme hinder and even possible reverse to major strides made against the terrorist groups. For instance, with the 10,000 Afghans, the possibility of 100 militants is quite plausible. Such militants might have extensive experience and expertise that could be useful for groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS. This could be extensive experience or skill in creating IEDs, suicide vests, or expertise in the use of heavy weapons that would be vital for terrorist groups in Somalia, including Al-Shabaab, which have been suffering major setbacks in recent weeks. This would also fit into the narrative being pushed by the global jihadi terrorist networks. The recent suicide bombing at the Kabul airport by ISIS-K has been seen as a major victory and a propaganda tool for terrorist groups attempted to portray a US defeat in Afghanistan, similar to the propaganda following Russian withdrawal in 1988. Now, this has already been used by groups like Al-Shabaab, which are attempting to utilize US withdrawal from Afghanistan to paint an image of a foreign occupation of Somalia by Amazon forces, which would easily capitulate once Amazon forces withdrew. The reality is that many of these refugees are destined for the United States. Diplomatic sources close to Wararka Media have confirmed that over 30,000 refugees were meant to be relocated in Gulf nations for processing prior to travel to the United States. This is mainly because the US remains reluctant to bring such a large number of Afghans due to security reasons. Similarly, the UAE has refused to give refugee status to any Afghan which is currently settled in the country. Therefore, two questions arise. One, why should Somalia be the nation to process, vet, and accommodate thousands of Afghan refugees when Somalia evidently doesn't have the means to do so? Secondly, if the US and the UAE are reluctant to process or grant refugee status, why is the UAE attempting to essentially dump thousands of people to be stranded in Somaliland? It is evident that there is no humanitarian concern. Now, this is not the first time that there has been a direct or indirect tensions between the Somali central government and the UAE regarding Somaliland. In 2018, Somalia was extremely troubled by an agreement signed between the UAE and the Somaliland authorities to build a UAE military base in Berbera. The Somali and Eritrea Monitoring Group confirmed in its 2018 annual report to the United Nations that the construction of new facilities were underway, which violated the UN arms embargo in Somalia. The Somali ambassador to the United Nations described the agreement as illegal, and here is what he had to say.
Mr. President, the Somali government will continue to be one that strives toward unity and works to enhance constructive dialogue in order to settle the outstanding issues between the federal government and all regional authorities. Nonetheless, we cannot abide any unconstitutional decisions taken by regional authorities, including northwestern region of Somaliland. since such actions will undermine the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Somalia, which are all guaranteed under our constitution. In that regard, with sights set up on preserving the unity of Somali territory and people, our parliament recently voted unanimously to reject United Arab Emirates-based DP World Agreement with the Northwestern Region Authority, Somaliland, and to commit the government of Somalia to taking measures to secure Somalia's unity and sovereignty under Article 1 of our Constitution. 2 years ago, United Arab Emirates signed an agreement with Somaliland regional authorities to establish UAE military base in Berbera port without the consent of the federal government of Somalia. The Somali-Eritrea Monitoring Group, SEMG, confirmed in its latest annual report, S/2017/924, that construction of the new facilities is underway. The monitoring group further stated that the establishment of foreign military base in Berbera involving the transfer of military material to the territory will constitute a violation of arms embargo on Somalia. This action is taken by UAE in Somalia are in clear violation of international law, the Charter of United Nations, and the norms of international relations and international cooperation. Therefore, the federal government of Somalia calls on the Security Council to take the necessary steps in accordance with its mandate to maintain international peace and security, to put an end to those actions and ensure the implementation of its resolutions concerning Somalia. The federal government of Somalia strongly condemns those blatant violations and reaffirms that it will take the necessary measures deriving from its primary responsibility to defend the inviolability of the sovereignty and the unity of Somalia in accordance with the Somali Constitution and international law and covenants. To conclude, Mr. President, I cannot end my remarks without once again expressing to the Council's gratitude of the people and the government of the Federal Republic of Somalia for the continued support made by the United Nations to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of our country and to guarantee its peace and political stability.
Evidently, the UAE signed an agreement with the Somaliland regional authorities to create a military base without the consent of the federal government of Somalia. This is a blatant violation of international law because under international law, regardless of one's political views, Somaliland is still legally considered part of Somalia. Of course, this is not the case in a practical sense, as Somaliland technically has no relations with the Somali federal government directly, with its own administration seeking independence. Now, the federal government of Somalia has called on the Security Council to take necessary steps to put an end to such intrusions. Now, the question becomes, why is the UAE so invested in Somaliland all of a sudden? Well, there are three main reasons. One, the UAE was interested in setting a military base in Somaliland due to its strategic location on the Gulf of Aden, a valuable asset in the midst of its campaigns in Yemen. Two, the action can also be perceived as a retaliation to the closure of the UAE base in Mogadishu, following souring relations between Mogadishu and Abu Dhabi. Lastly, there remains a brewing Cold War in the Middle East, raging between the GCC states and Turkey and Qatar, competing for influence in Somalia, with Turkey having bases in Mogadishu as well as providing heavy infrastructure support. The geopolitical war raging in the Horn of Africa between Middle Eastern powers began when the current president of Somalia, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, decided not to cut ties with Qatar following the Gulf dispute. A warmer relationship between Turkey, Qatar and Somalia grew, ultimately resulting in the disbanding of UAE military training camps in Mogadishu in 2018, with the Somali government accusing the UAE of attempting to utilize its trained Somali forces that it pays for to its advantage. As a direct response, the UAE shut down Abu Sheikh Zayed Hospital, which provided healthcare for poor people in Mogadishu. It was following the disbanding of the UAE-trained Somali troops and the camp that the UAE decided to sign an agreement with the Somaliland administration to begin work on the port of Berbera, bypassing Mogadishu. The deal would go against the Somali Provisional Constitution, which stipulated that all legal foreign agreements are to be signed by the federal government of Somalia in Mogadishu and not by member states. For those viewers who might disagree, the Somali government in Mogadishu perceives Somaliland as a member state, and consequently, Somali parliament declared the agreement void. It was on the 2nd of March 2018 when the Somali Prime Minister Hassan Ali Khaire, alongside the Somali Minister of Ports, Madam Marian Awais, declared the agreement illegal. stating that the agreement violated the sovereignty of Somalia, and further elaborated that no foreign corporation can enter an agreement within Somalia without the knowledge of the Somali central government. The President of Somalia, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, stated in a speech in the parliament that any country can invest in Somalia. However, they must seek official approval from the constitutionally assigned institutions of the federal government, warning against foreign companies and states not to violate the sovereignty and the unity of Somalia. Now, tensions between the two countries grew further when $9.6 million sent from Abu Dhabi to the UAE embassy in Mogadishu was confiscated by Somali authorities at Aden at the airport, while the Emirati ambassador insisted that the money was to be paid to UAE-trained Somali soldiers. The Somali government officials stated that it was 10 times the amount expected, raising questions about its intended destination. Now, if we take a look back in history, since 2011, the UAE has developed closer ties with regional states, not only in the form of aid and training, but also help with infrastructure projects and using regional states as a market for Somali livestock. These closer ties also exist in the form of private business and investment. Many Somali business owners and tycoons have headquarters in Dubai. This means that many of the regional economies are heavily reliant and tied to the UAE. Therefore, logically, the strong business and financial relationship between regional states and the UAE is inevitable. Conversely, the Somali federal government has continued to form stronger relations with Turkey, which enabled the FSG to gain access to unprecedented military hardware, equipment, and training, as well as financial and infrastructure support. What is clear is that the raging Cold War between the Middle Eastern adversaries has spilled into Somalia, splintering the nation into two factions. One faction being the pro-UAE and the GCC regional states, and the other faction being the federal government and its supporters, which are both pro-Turkish and pro-Qatari. This has made cohesion and unity regarding many internal and foreign policies difficult in Somalia, with many regional states openly opposing federal government policy both internally and abroad. The splintering is most evident in the current elections. The continued confiscation of monies of late in Mogadishu was alleged to have arrived from Dubai has raised many eyebrows. Indeed, many regional leaders continue to fly to Dubai. For instance, President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, in a televised interview with Shabelle Media Network, accused Puntland leader Saeed Deni of flying to Dubai in late 2020 following the September 17th agreement, only to return to have changed his mind, which ultimately led to the major setbacks in election agreements in the early 2021 period. Many presidential candidates have also been accused of having direct relations with Dubai, with many flying to the UAE quite often and receiving many donations from UAE businesses. Evidently, this political deadlock will continue to affect Somalia in the foreseeable future. Middle Eastern Cold War, which has affected Libya, Yemen, Syria, and now Somalia will end, is a difficult question to answer. However, the reality remains that for Somalia to see drastic improvement and development on any level, regional states and the federal government must have a united view and place the interests of the Somali people first, rather than continuing being proxies for foreign adversaries in a continued rage of instability and a lack of prosperity.